Let's talk about community gardens. I'm going to share 7 tips and insights for your community garden to get better involvement, greater outcomes, and that sense of community that comes with a shared space for growing. I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. Now, you might have a large garden at home. You may have been thinking about a garden, but one of the best ways to get started with gardening is to start with a community garden. And for a community garden to be successful, I believe there are 7 core elements to every community garden. I'm going to cover those elements here in no particular order, as well as some insights about the value of a community garden. And then I'll explore this topic in greater detail in future programs that we're putting together as community gardens are being established across our region. Now, right now, with COVID and supply chain issues associated with food, the dumping of milk, the sterilization or the abortion of hog, so the volume of hogs are not there. Potatoes are being left to rot in the field because the supply chain disruption happened both on the consumption side and on the production side. Altogether, this means higher food prices. This means more difficult access to food, and a community garden is a solution for both. You want to start, number one, with a clear community focus. Why are you starting or reestablishing or operating a community garden? What about that community garden can serve those nearest to the garden and serve the needs and well-being of the community? Well, there was a community garden in South Central LA that actually reduced crime. Turns out that when gangsters spent time in the garden, they got to know each other and they were less likely to fight. And very often when they're busy in the garden, they were not out on street corners with idle activities. And there's a number of documentaries on this, and they actually interview Bloods and Crips who garden right next to each other and have no problem with each other after a little bit of just getting to know each other and understanding shared experiences. That's a huge value of a community garden because you're there about the gardening. You're there about the community. You're there about outcomes beyond individual needs. The next thing is a core educational experience. A lot of folks don't know how to garden. A lot of folks are concerned, and they sometimes believe that you need to have a lot of chemical inputs, that you need to have the perfect tomato, and they don't really understand the nutrition of gardening. You garden for health. You garden for nutrition. You garden for the experience to get outside. You garden for the skill and technique. Very often, organic gardening gives you a better opportunity to get close to soil, like the soil food web, for example. What is soil? What's good fertility? How do you compost? What's the biology behind compost? Your community garden with a strong educational experience for participants is going to be something where they can come back year after year. It really doesn't matter if they're 12 years old or 90 years old. There's something they can learn and share in a community garden environment. Number 3, it's really also about the care of the land. Your community garden will be quickly depleted if you don't have proper management of the land. Now, we're going to talk a couple other tips about the structure of a community garden and how setting it up facilitates the care of the land. But you really need to be sure that you're bringing the right kinds of materials in, and that you're properly handling waste associated with your community garden, and that you're restoring that land. You're increasing the property value through cultivation of gardens. Number 4, clearly posted guidelines. I know when a bunch of people get together, there's always arguments and things are unclear. You do need to have some guidelines. There are plants that you may not want to be growing in your area. There are plants you may want to try. There are, how do you structure the beds? Does a family own a bed, or do they lease a bed? Some communities have plots where you own the plot and you can build a frame or something, or you're planting just in the ground. Some have shared spaces. You do want to make that clear, because when you're growing, there'll be a little bit of competition, and people will you have these concerns. You want to make sure that you set the guidelines. My guidelines for a community garden is all organic. You don't have to bring anything on site. No power tools, no nothing. We provide shovels, provide the rakes. We provide pruning tools, and you can just check that stuff out of the shared cabinet and you're done. We want to make it easy on the individuals using the garden, but also maintain guidelines so that nobody's coming in and spraying, DEET and Roundup and things on everything. Number 5, you want to provide a framework for success. Now, this is that structure I'm talking about. If you have heavy deer, you put up a large fence around the garden. If you have an area that's got a little more structure, maybe in an urban space, you might have raised beds. If you are a garden that's handicap accessible, you might have some raised beds that are 4 foot high, and you may have some raised beds that are only 6 inches high. You may have mulch paths rather than just simple grass, or you may have grass that gets mowed every week. It's really up to the structure of your community garden, but the community garden provides the majority of the framework associated with gardening so that your members can simply come in, take care of their plot. Now, this is very important. Structure requires funding. It'll cost less when the community shares the funding, but there will be a committee that's looking for grants as well as determining what the plot fees would be. A lot of plot fees could be seasonal, one-time payment for season, and that'll take care of establishing the framework. It could be fencing, it could be raised beds, it could be accessibility, it could be making sure the parking lot's clean, and then you're going to have scheduled monthly work days where people can come in and work. Now, I'm not about trying to make it affordable. What you'll find is that once people start gardening and realizing how much money they save on groceries, how much more healthy the food is, how valuable the experience is, they'll be willing to invest in that kind of outcome. And it'll be like a garden country club in most cases. But you want to make sure that you're not trying to play the diversity game or play the inclusion game. There's always a work opportunity that has a certain amount of value to it. Now, I'm a permaculture design consultant. You can go into communities of sharing, but that's not appropriate for right now. The key is that the structure that you provide is self-funded. You're not waiting on government handouts. You're not waiting on some rich person to give you money. The labor or financial contributions of members needs to more than cover whether you're putting up a tall fence or a short fence, whether you're building raised beds or not. I see too many cities and municipalities put together a community garden that is completely overbuilt. In fact, it's built in such a way that it's not really convenient to the users of the garden itself, and those who are participating in the project don't get the value for it. So, for example, the city might go pick a piece of land, a vacant lot somewhere, and they want to beautify the lot, so they put a community garden in there, but there's no parking, it's hard to get to. They put a gate up and lock it so you can't get to it at odd hours. It may be better to put the community garden at an elementary school or a middle school and make its hours of operations far beyond when there's students on site, but also tie it into learning opportunities for the school itself. And that's something that's a decision based on the community. Church gardens are incredible because usually the community of the church can extend their daily activities to include the garden, and they can even use the garden as part of an aesthetic space for prayer or worship. Your civic groups, or even just a few neighbors getting together and sharing a plot of land that's in their own neighborhood. That's always better than these overbuilt gardens. So I want to make sure that you understand that it's the labor and money that covers your garden of the members, not if we would have a picnic table if we could get a grant. No, it would be sit down and say, how can we have a picnic table? If everybody wants a picnic table, how do we get one? And somebody probably got a picnic table in their backyard they're not using. You can buy a kit and somebody can donate the lumber, and then another person puts it all together. It's about that interaction between people to get a mutually valuable outcome. Now, these do not work on large scale. If the state government or the federal government decided community gardens were valuable and everybody should have a community garden, that just doesn't work as well as 4 or 5 neighbors getting together, or the church men's group getting together and handling the framework of the garden while the youth programs handle the planting and the day-to-day activities. If you are going to enforce a statewide because I hear a lot of people say, well, the city ought to put up some money for this. If you're going to enforce a statewide community garden, you're going to want to look at right after the Cultural Revolution, when China mandated grow-at-home food because their larger scale farming didn't work out very well, and their central planning of food did not work out very well. You want community members to come together, develop the minimum viable garden space, enjoy it, use it, participate in it, and cultivate it, because then you're going to get different types of hard to find fruits and vegetables. You're going to get a decision whether you should have a permanent orchard space attached to the garden, or are you just going to have a simple garden with beds and a large barrier fence to keep deer out, for example. This is very important. The framework for success is provided by the organizer of the community garden. Number 6, you want to encourage gardening of all ages. This is a family activity. This is, the kids can go out there, and it's a safe space for kids to socialize or to garden. You would want to have your gathering area separate of your growing spaces, because people would get upset if somebody's poaching tomatoes. But ultimately, all ages. You want educational events designed for kids. There's many studies that show that when kids interact with nature, they have better behavior, they have better health and immune systems. But the same for adults. The greatest opportunity would be the retirement home, bringing the bus over and having a picnic lunch at your community garden. Or even some of the members of your garden could be, able to get transportation now being near public transportation is not exactly required, but think about those opportunities. Who will be at your garden? Who will benefit from the garden? And number 7 is, how can we make the garden a community center? It could be a community of faith. It could be a community of social activity. I've seen American Legions have a small little garden area that was primarily ornamental. And so they had, basically, you come into you see the building, and then as you walk into the entryway, around the main entryway, there was actually roses and different types of flowers and different types of bushes and shrubs that were, the framework was the core bushes and shrubs, but then there were other plants around those that were maintained by members, and members had plots a little bit further away, and they had a small little nursery site. And that actually was a great activity that kept members coming back to the location. And they did their patriotic duty. And actually, around their flagpole had a beautiful setup around the flagpole. And then they had a slight parade ground on either side of this walkway. So if you imagine a building with a sidewalk and then a little circular area that had a flagpole, and then then you can go the rest of the way to the building. Around that was all decorated, and that was an extension of their community space, which was ultimately primarily ornamental. Beautiful. They had herb gardens and other things for members to come by and enjoy, but it's a greater use of land. That's what these 7 tips are all about. These 7 keys to success for a community garden. It's about that maximum value and use of land. How do we help our members? How do we help our community? How do we help those people who we like to socialize with? I've seen country clubs with community gardens. I've seen country clubs that took a community garden approach to their landscaping, and we're talking about that with a local country club here. We're also working with a couple other community gardens and maintaining some communications between those areas so that they can get their plots lended out or leased out. It depends on the arrangement. But these 7 tips for success will get your community garden going. If you have questions about starting a community garden in your neighborhood, especially with food deserts being a real issue today in America, especially with supply chain disruptions, and a community garden is a space that brings health and physical well-being to entire communities, I highly encourage you to think about getting something started. And if you need help with that, I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. You can visit us at www.prosperityhomestead.org. If you've got a garden club, a permaculture group, or any naturalist projects, community garden is a perfect complement to those activities. Again, you can ask your questions at www.prosperityhomestead.org.